Welcome to the Beza Performance live stream. My name is Marshall Henley, and today is again S&OP Thursday. So I'll bring up my colleague, Doug Dedman, and we'll get started. Whoops, sorry. Jumped the gun. I always do something right at the beginning. I finally made a mistake, the one on the 13th at the very end, but mostly I make a mistake at the beginning. So very few people see the one at the end. Everybody sees the one at the beginning. So welcome,
That's
Doug.
okay. That's okay. I always got to have a little humor to start everything off there.
Well, ironically, we're in a series called "What Does Good Look Like," which my production skills would not show up in that series whatsoever. But the idea is, what does an S&OP process, an executive S&OP process, look like? We've got 8 components that we are talking about. We took a break from the 8 components last time on the 13th to talk about our new online assessment, and I'll let you all know where you can get that. We have that available at bezaperformance.com as well as dvmsys.com. Worked real hard on it, and it will probably take you about 10 minutes to complete, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. The part that will take some time is for you to digest all the prescriptions, because there's very specific and important prescriptions to help you raise your S&OP game, your executive S&OP game that it'll spit out. But today is about responsible and accountable within a RACI concept and the S&OP process. So with that, I'm just going to throw it over to you, Doug, and let you kind of explain what we're covering.
Yeah, no problem at all, Marshall. Yeah, and if you just want to bring up my screen, I'll maybe talk to that a little bit as we go through this. So as you mentioned, Marshall, there's the 8 areas that we've been really talking through as we go through this, which is really the 8 areas that are part of the assessment as well. And today the focus is going to be on this responsibility and accountability. And the idea of the what does good look like is really to drive your process to the point of being able to have a good executive S&OP process that really kind of achieves these things, right? So I'm just kind of level setting back to where we've been talking about is,
The culmination.
Is your S&O executive meeting a report out or a decision-making meeting, right? So we're trying to get to that decision-making process. So the things we're talking about is moving it more to that decision-making meeting. Is it effective and efficient, right? In other words, can I get through the entire business in 1.5 hours? Does everyone walk out of the meeting on the same page and ready to execute the same plan? Another real important thing to think about. And really the final one on there is your senior executive really engaged in the meeting. And so all that we've been, kind of working through is how do you really answer yes to each one of these questions, and how do you get there with your executive process? So that's been the focus. And as we said, today is on responsibility and accountability. And so what I thought I would do, Marshall, is just walk through a few, topics. Whoops, I went too fast. So if I go through the topics, I'll just quickly touch on what RACI is for those that aren't familiar with it. And then really how that relates to the S&OP plans that you've got, right? How does it then relate to the process? And then some ideas on how can you document it and how can you track that you have the right stuff in place? Because it's one thing to, just talk about it, but if you actually document it and are actually able to hold people accountable for their accountability, I know that's maybe might be a little too meta for everyone, but that's that's really what we're trying to get to. So, so if that sounds like it makes sense, I'll maybe jump right into that.
Great plan.
Yeah. So to start with, for those that aren't familiar with the concept of RACI, and I pulled this from, years ago, I had my PMP as part of the project management side of things that I used to do a lot of. And so this was a big deal as we were defining projects and went through it. And it's something that we've kind of carried forward and thinking about from an S&OP standpoint. And I just thought I would just go through these definitions so you know, because sometimes there's a bit of confusion about what does each of these mean, right? And so the way you can think about it is, so RACI stands for responsible, accountable, communicated, and informed. And the responsible side of things is the person who has to complete the task. So you can think about that as the doer, the one that you're saying, hey, this has got to get done. I want to know, who am I looking at in the room, right, to make sure that it is getting done. That's the responsible person for that. And it sometimes gets confused with the accountable person, right? And the way you can think about this is, the accountable person is the person who has to make decisions or take actions out of the tasks. So if I think about it, and I'll touch on this later on, but if we think about developing a demand plan, for example, right? So you've
Right.
got a demand plan that you might have a demand planner who is responsible for developing that demand plan. But the person who's accountable for the demand plan, for actually delivering that demand
Mm.
plan, like actually delivering the sales associated with the demand plan, that accountable person is typically going to be like your VP of sales, right? Or might be a regional manager, whatever that happens to be. So
Business unit leader, something like
business
that.
unit leader on that side of things. And so it's an important piece to think about. So I always think of, responsible is the doer, accountable is the person that I would say owns the process. This is the term I use often with that.
Mhm.
So hopefully that's fairly clear. And I'm spending a fair amount of time on those two because when we look at the whole RACI piece, these are the two that we focus on to make sure you get this definition real clear as you
Yeah.
go through the process. Okay.
Yep.
The other two things that within the RACI construct, really, you've got the person is someone who's consulted, right? So they're communicated as part of the decision making process. You can think about, these are the additional people in the room who don't have that particular responsibility and accountability. And then informed, right? Someone who's just going to be updated on what's happened there. And so like I said, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is going to focus on really the first two areas of that: responsible and accountable.
Yep. Yeah,
Uh,
in fact, probably 90% of what we do when we do S&OP is about that, and then we fill in the CNI later, but
yeah,
that's critical.
yeah, and the reason it's important to focus on that, because it's like the same idea as any kind of leadership piece. If we're not clear on who we're actually holding responsible or who's accountable for something, or we say, well, Doug's responsible and Marshall's responsible for it. Well, the minute we have that, we got a problem, because I now have two people responsible for something, and then if that's the situation, then you really want to define that task to another level of detail, so it's
Yeah.
really clear what Marshall's responsible and what's Doug's responsible for.
Yeah, we have almost all of our clients have matrixed organizations, but when you get to the S&OP process, you're gonna have to decide for each component of it, at least at a family level, who's responsible.
Yeah,
Can't be 2 people.
and it takes a little bit of practice to get there.
Yeah.
Like, it's not. I mean, sometimes you think, oh, this should be really, really clear in the organization, but we get started on this, and especially when we take demand and we break it down into the demand streams, and we say, well, we've got these different, demand flows coming in. Often we can say, oh, okay, well, it's pretty clear who's responsible for developing that demand plan. But then the question is, and this gets asked, I always ask this of the senior executive, so the president or the CEO, is, okay, if we're sitting in the room and the demand didn't happen, who are you looking at in the room that you're going to say, well, you know, what what happened there, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right, and who's accountable for it? Because that it's very clear when the business is running, who's accountable for ultimately for how the business performs.
Sure.
But then a lot of this is, how do we then take that down some levels to really be real clear on that responsibility and accountability?
And I don't know how much we're getting into this today, but it's important to emphasize there are some wrong answers to that question. Like,
Yeah.
if you're looking at the wrong person, that's part of where the process may be wrong.
Yep.
I remember we had a a client there before we had sort of gotten involved with them. They were holding the operations group accountable for inventory, but they were the ones, in fact, who had requested that they were making the bet that the sales were going to come through on a new product. So they want, and it was a buyout, so they had to get it, with
Yep.
enough lead time they could have it. So they bought, millions of dollars of this product, and then it's in inventory, and then they're pointing at ops saying, you got to get rid of that
Right.
inventory. And it sounds a little simplistic. It was a little more complicated than that. But at the end of the day, that kind of was it, right? Like they needed to go to the sales team and say, well, how are you going to get rid of this inventory? Because you're the only ones who can at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. When you recount that story, I almost have a visceral reaction to that, because those are those ones where you go, yeah, it
Learning
took a bit.
experience.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a learning experience. Sometimes learning experiences can be challenging, right? So,
Yeah,
yeah. So let's maybe jump in a little bit, because I think that's
sure.
a good segue, Marshall, into kind of the next thing I wanted to cover, which really ties it to. And if you've been following the live streams, we keep coming back to this presentation, this model of how you present your families, right? So the 5-section sheet. So this idea that when you look at a family, you these 5 sections will actually present a story or a model for how the business is running for that family. And so we've got our bookings here at the top. We've got our shipments next. So our bookings are the new orders that have come in. Our shipments are the orders that we're sending out, the shipments going out the door. We've got our backlog plan, which we show both as a total number as well as your current aged backlog, right, or your open orders. And then we've got our supply picture, which is made up of capability and our production plan. And then we've got our inventory down here. And so, what's one of the things that's so important about this model is it actually provides a lot of clarity through to this idea of accountability. And so I'll take you through kind of each section, and that should hopefully become a little bit clearer. And I'm focusing on accountability here. I will touch on responsibility as well, but responsibility can change depending on the organization. So I'll start with the bookings one, and this one should be really, really clear for people. The accountability for the bookings plan, the order inflow, has to sit with sales. And you might say, oh, sales and or marketing, potentially product management if you've got business units that are managing product development. But in the very near term, for sure, this is the responsibility of sales in 99% of the organizations that we work with, because this is the order inflow. It's the booking of the order, regardless of when it's going to ship. So whether you're like a long lead time, you've got long customer lead times, or you have short lead times, you're really driving that to the sales side of things. And the granularity of that is, even though we're showing this by family, right? The granularity of that then would typically go down to the different demand streams. So if I've got a demand stream that's set up for my distributors, it might be the sales person or the part of the sales organization that's responsible for distributors, right? If I'm now looking at a flow business that I'm, forecasting, I might have somebody generating a forecast for that. But whoever's responsible for that piece of the sales for this particular family is the one you're going to, the owner of that is going to be the one that's going to be accountable.
Good.
So, yeah. So that should be real clear. And that's a real important part for people that are struggling with this idea of, well, why do I need to have bookings? We don't have a lot of lead time. We're just selling from our inventory.
Mm-hmm.
However, you can't sell it if you don't take the orders. And whoever's responsible for getting those orders in, there is no one else in the organization, right? You're going to hold accountable to this number. There is no one on the rest of the organization that can really manage that. That's got to be to the sales side of the house.
It's a little off topic, but I just want to be emphasizing this too, that those are units, not dollars. So
Yes.
of course you hold sales accountable for the dollar bookings. That's how most organizations are thinking. But we're talking about actually getting the unit numbers sold, not at a mix level, at a family level, so that uh, and again, it's not punitive. It's just the idea of what happened. Like, go to the responsible party and ask what happened. What can we do to fix
Yep.
it, or how can we fix it in the future?
Yep. And the accountability piece of this that's real important on this sheet is we have our plan going forward, which is our, our forecast. I like to use the word demand plan because it's not just a generated forecast.
You can do
And
something about a plan. It's not
we can,
happening to you.
right. A plan is something you expect somebody to actually try and deliver on, right?
Sure.
A forecast is, well, I licked my finger, I put it up in the air, and we all know the rules of forecast. I'm not going to get into that. But,
Yeah.
anyways, the accountability piece of this, if you look at these two numbers here, is this is the month that has just been completed. And I have accountability for the actual number against the plan. And so not only am I saying you're accountable for generating that plan forward, you're actually accountable to deliver the plan. And I've got a way to measure that each
Yeah.
month.
Yeah. What are we going to sell 11 months from now? Somebody's accountable for that too.
Right.
What do we think we're
Exactly.
going to sell? Yeah.
Yep. So I'm going to
I have
jump.
no idea is not an acceptable answer.
Yes, exactly. So I'm going to jump down to the supply side here, and you'll see in a minute why I'm going to do this, because on the supply side, which really you can think about this as if this was a production line, a family run on a particular production line. We're
Sure.
talking about the units coming off that line, right? And so I've got a plan, which would be tied to my master schedule or my production plan going forward of what I plan to build, right? And it's got to be within my capability, right? So I've got accountability to have a realistic plan going forward, that's in there. That's not going to drive me to a negative inventory. That's not going to um, uh, be above my capability, or that plan will include an increase in capability, right? So those things. But then I'm holding that team accountable
Hmm.
for delivering the production number that we've committed to. And so that's a real important thing, because if I don't actually look at this number and I'm only focused on the shipment number, I have this conflicting, or I have some ambiguity, if you
Yeah.
will, between what can potentially, who's accountable, who's responsible.
I remember a project that we started where they had a pretty big up goal for the year in terms of increasing shipments, sales. Um, and yet the person who they were holding accountable for the supply side plan was keeping one eye on the inventory number that had been reported to corporate, and were driving the number of the supply number the wrong direction. And when
Yep.
they got to see the output, it was a little shocking because they were planning to fail. They were not going to be able to ship what their plan was because they
Right.
were not. So that just the accountability and clarity of the 5 section sheet that brought out the accountability was helpful.
Yeah. That's the classic example of somebody sitting in their car and they got one foot on the gas and they got the
Yeah.
other foot on the brake at the same time. And that works for a while, but eventually something's got to give, right? So, um, at the price of fuel as it was earlier in the summertime, you probably didn't want to do that too long, right? So, so the next section that I skipped over was the shipments, right? And you'll see here, and you're going to say, "Hey, Doug, you said we can't have two people that are accountable." And I put it as the sales, and you'll see here I've got sales and I've got the team here um, uh, identified, and it's because the sales can generate the unconstrained shipment plan, right? So this is what is my external view, my market facing view of the shipments. If I don't have to worry
Bookings
about
basically is what we're
the
talking
booking,
about there. Yeah.
yeah, and that's really bookings translating into shipments, or in some places you might generate a statistical forecast
Yeah.
that's off of the shipments, right? But you really want that to be what do we actually think that the sales could be, right? So you might do a statistical forecast, then you might do a management override, all of those kind of things, come up
Yes.
with the unconstrained plan. But the team, right? And this is the S&OP team here, has to be responsible and accountable for generating, accountable for what that constrained plan is. And that's really the constrained plan that you want to present in the executive meeting,
Yeah.
saying, hey, this is what we believe that we can deliver or where we think we need to go. Um, and so that's an important one. And you'll notice I do this at the demand stream level as well, because one of the decisions, and we've seen a lot of that throughout this year, where people are in a situation where they don't have enough supply, right? That they're actually having to constrain it. Well, when you do that constraining, you need to think about what pieces of the business for this family, what demand stream. So if it's as I said before, distributors, and maybe you've got some distributors, you've got end customers. You might say, I'm going to constrain some of the inventory to my or production away from my distributors and drive that to my end customers directly. That's a strategic decision. It's an
Yes.
output of the process.
Yes.
Yeah. So
So maybe I mean, I don't want to jump the gun too, but if I do, I guess it's too late. We when we talk about shipments, there really is one person responsible for the shipment plan. They don't put it together, but they authorize it, and that is the executive that owns sales and operations. So the sales team and the operations team are independently responsible for their component of the shipment plan, which would be the bookings turning into the unconstrained shipments, then being constrained, and then same thing with operations on the supply side. But if there's a problem and we don't hit shipments, then typically it's not something other than one of those two folks or both, right? That's the idea. And then the executive would be kind of responsible for, uh, accountable for
yeah,
holding them accountable and figuring out, where the miss was and what can we do to avoid it in the future and how can we fix the current miss if that's possible.
right. And the reason and where that accountability or where that problem lies will start to be identifiable in this model, right? Because if you think about it, right, and we use this term all the time. Hey, if you don't sell it and you can't make it, you can't or if you right, you can't ship it,
Right.
right? So if I don't have the orders and I can't make it, I can't ship it. But it's often not both of those things, it's one or the other.
Yeah.
And if we put a balanced plan together last month, right? Because we do that and then we look at it again last month or the next month. It means the number here, the number here, and the number here, if you will, would be all part of a balanced plan. And then if I miss, below or above, right, I can see what caused the miss, because either I missed on the production side, or I missed on the booking side, or it's going to be a little bit of a combination of both. And in this
Mm.
case, if you look at it, we had lots of bookings, right?
Yeah.
Our bookings were really, really high,
Yeah.
but our production number was lower than what we had planned, right? And so when I look at that, it wasn't drastically lower, but we did have that. So that, like you said, the answer is not always obvious,
Yeah.
obvious, obvious, but
Just
you can.
because you have a balanced plan doesn't mean it's a realistic plan either. A lot of folks think their capacities are higher than they really are. And, we're going to make more stuff than we've ever made in the history of the company because we need to, because there's a lot of pressure on the demand side to fulfill. But
Yeah,
that's the stuff you learn through S&OP. You
yeah.
figure out that that's your problem. You need to get realistic on your production. And
I think that's a real important observation, Marshall, is just because I have a balanced plan doesn't mean it's realistic. And the number of companies that it takes a while to get beyond this living on hope idea,
yeah,
right? And it's just because, well, there was that one time, do you remember like 6 years ago, everything was perfect and we produced 20,000 units in the month, and it was just, yeah, but that's that one snapshot in time, and everybody
yeah, you had
forgets
one
what
color, it
happened.
was black, and
Yeah,
it's a
exactly. I
lot
had this
easier
huge
back then.
huge order, and nobody looks at what happened the month before and the month after when everybody,
Yeah.
So anyways,
The only other thought I would throw in on this slide is you can start to see if you're paying attention to this, the executive really can manage the business through the S&OP process. It's not
Yeah.
a report out to them so they happen to know what's going on. They're actually deciding what's going on with the balanced plan. And the reason that works is we're at a family level here, not a mixed level. So you're not going to have more than maybe 10 of these families to even deal with. And maybe 6 of those are on autopilot and you're just sort of, yeah, that's good. And the 4 that need your attention, get your attention. And then you
Yep.
spend the rest of the month supporting the execution of the balanced plan. And that's what S&OP is for. And I think that when we get to this sort of clean, well-defined RACI, as clean as it can be, right? It's got to be it's got to be somebody. So it's got to be somebody that has the ability to be responsible and accountable. Then you end up running the business with
Yep.
this process.
Yep. And this model is the thing that we drive to work with executives, that they can read this really, really quickly, see
Yes.
what's going on, and hold the team accountable. And that's really the crux of everything we're talking about here is, how do I hold the team accountable? This breaks that business up in the family into,
Yes.
where do I hold them, so I'm real, real clear.
So
Um,
I always say you need this and Hoshin Connery if you want to deliver, breakthrough strategic results on a, 3 or more year plan or a 2 or more year plan. Then this has got to be in place along with
yeah,
Hoshin.
yeah.
For those of you that have Hoshin.
Yeah, and so a couple of things I just wanted to highlight on here, that it's always kind of interesting. And you picked up on the inventory one, but just also talking about the backlog one, where
Yes.
it's like you'll have an executive yelling at either operations, or it's usually operations, say like, our backlog, it's a real problem. Like, it's way out of, you guys got to fix this. The backlog is actually a pretty strategic buffer for you, right, between your bookings and your shipments. And really, it's an outcome of the process. And really, you should be establishing what that target is, because this can be, if backlog's a big deal and delivery times are a big deal, this can be a strategic advantage, competitive advantage in some business. In some businesses, it doesn't matter as much, right? And
Yes. Yeah.
so, and in some businesses, the more backlog you have, the better, right?
Yeah.
And so,
Or
really,
or it might be by family. One family it matters a lot, and the other
absolutely,
family it doesn't matter.
we work with a lot of companies where that's the case, right?
Yeah.
Where some families, I really want to have a target backlog, and other families, I got to ship out there. And then you might
Yeah.
have to just pop us
Well,
off the screen for. Oh, go ahead, Marshall.
oh sure. Pop us off. So yeah,
Yeah,
I see
just
what
for
you're
a
saying.
second, I'll cover the last one. I know you have a burning question, but I'll get through this one here on the
Yeah.
last one here, which is the inventory side of things. And once again, you picked up on this early with your the story that you talked about of one of our clients, and I would say it's not just one of them that we've seen that. This accountability is an outcome of the process, a strategic decision,
Hmm.
and that's the target, right? That is the target. The actual inventory number is a result of the plan, right? Because my inventory going forward is going to be current inventory plus production minus whatever I ship out there. And so,
Yeah.
if you think about that can be a strategic thing you're driving to. If I'm trying to build inventory, strategic thing I'm driving to, and I should be able to see it in the plan. If I'm trying to build inventory for a shutdown or for an engineering change, I should be able to see that in the plan, and that's a pretty important one there. So,
Okay.
um, yeah,
No, let's keep going. I don't have a question.
okay.
I
So
make these
hopefully,
things too long.
yeah, yeah. Hopefully that gives you a sense of how does it tie to the model, the data, that really we look at the S&OP process. I thought what I would also do then is quickly talk about accountability as it relates to the monthly process, right?
Okay.
So,
That's
I mean,
great.
this should be fairly clear. And accountability and responsibility. Um, I don't think I pulled it up for this first one, but you need to have someone that's responsible, right, and really accountable at the beginning of the month to be collecting the actual data that from the last month. So I don't think I really called that out in this piece, because
Okay.
you want to have that data to work for accountability, as you go forward to the next pieces. So if I look at this, and some of these should be fairly obvious, right? Accountability for that S&OP demand meeting really should be the VP of sales. I'm putting the VP of sales. You can kind of plug in who it is within your organization, but it's the sales owner. And then you might go, in most cases, you'll go a level down and you'll say, well, by family. And you might even go a level down below that by demand stream within there, who might be held accountable for those individual parts of that. But the accountability to developing an S&OP demand plan out of this, which is what that outcome is, the unconstrained demand plan, lies with your sales leader. The responsibility for this might vary within the organization. So, in a lot of cases, it's a demand planner that's got to have that responsibility. Some cases, it's the S&OP coordinator that fits both of those roles. Some cases, it might be the sales rep. So that's who's actually putting it together. Should be fairly straightforward. Um, if I go to the next one on the pre-S&OP supply meeting, the accountability, VP of Ops. If you're a buy for sale company, it might be your VP of supply chain. So that's where that accountability sits, and the responsibility typically is it's going to be a master scheduler, might be the GM of a plant if you kind of look at the plant level, and the S&OP coordinator. In most cases, or not most cases, in some cases, that S&OP coordinator sits in, might be sitting in one of these roles as well. So the outcome of that is your supply plan. So now if I get to the pre-S&OP meeting on this accountability here, because here's where I'm actually going through and constraining the plan, developing the presentation. The responsibility piece is pretty important in that the S&OP coordinator takes a much more outsized role in this to make sure it all comes together. But the accountability for that plan has to sit with the team. And really, I put on here VP of sales, VP of ops. It might vary depending on whether you're constrained or unconstrained, right? So if you're unconstrained, right, we don't have to do any constraining on the demand plan. Often this sits with the VP of ops side of it. But ultimately, we've got to get that all done, and everybody's got to agree to the plan. And then if we get to the final meeting, and this one is just so important, is the accountability for that meeting sits with the CEO or the president. And you can't delegate that accountability, because they're the only one who can make the final call across the business. Otherwise, you're going to get this, finger pointing. It's this guy, right? Or sat in meetings where the ops guys are all second guessing the sales plans, right? Or the sales guys are saying, well, yeah, we can't sell this because you guys can't produce it. Well,
Yeah, and I think when you're accountable, meaning you've authorized the plan, then execution of the plan becomes a little bit. I mean, you have cover. If you're ops and you're
yes,
worried that you're going to overproduce, then you can't overproduce because you're going to produce what's in the plan. You
right,
might
right.
underproduce, and sometimes you overproduce. I don't, there might be some things, but essentially, it gives you the right. You're now working as a team instead of on an island.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So hopefully that gives you a sense through this. There's nuances to all of this. So I mean, you might go, hey, you're oversimplifying. Yes, I am.
Yeah,
But
not terribly though.
no, not terribly. I think if you look at that, and as you peel down through the organization, whether it's regional setup or things like that, you're gonna, there's gonna be nuances to this, and
Sure.
that's fine, right?
Yeah.
But the point I'm making on this is you've got to be real clear on what that is, because if you're not, right, then you're kind of caught in this, well, who am I really who do I look at in the room and want to know if something doesn't happen the way I wanted it to happen? Who do I hold to that? So
So you have some good documentation. I don't want to take too much time on it, but did you
yeah,
bring that so we can talk about that a bit? I really
I
like
did
the way you
actually.
did that.
If you flip to that, and like I said, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I would strongly encourage that as you're going through this, that you do some documentation similar to this. Now, this is we start with it because typically when we're working with companies, we're starting with a pilot family,
Yeah.
right? And so part of what we're trying to do is teach you how do you document this in a way that then you can expand this and take it beyond that? And so if I look at it, this is a simple thing where I can put in,
Mhm.
the role. And then if I think of the meetings, and the way we do this is we'll say who's accountable for the meeting. So the one who really owns the meeting, who is responsible, who makes sure the meeting is running, the data's there, all of that sort of stuff. And then we have really two other things we typically will identify: a delegate, as you can see down here. This is really kind of the person that the person who's accountable kind of puts as their delegate. So it's kind of like the assistant accountable, if you will.
Yeah. I
um,
come in the name of sort of a
yeah, I
person.
come in the name of, exactly. And then informed really is that meeting attendee. And in this case, I kind of use informed similar to consulted, in
Yes.
that they're in that meeting. And so by doing this to start out with, it actually gives you a little attendance record of who do you expect to have in each one of those meetings.
Mhm.
On our simple form, the reason this one shows up as red is because we haven't actually identified a delegate,
Yes.
as part of that, and we use some measurements, which we'll talk about at a later date on how that kind of comes together.
So if
Yeah,
you're a RACI purist, the R is the same, the A is the same, the D is just an A that's been
yeah,
delegated, and then the C is, we're calling it an I here because it's informed, but they're really in the meeting and interacting.
yeah,
They're
yeah,
not just informed. So not to be
yeah.
confusing, but we like to use things that are helpful to the client, not strictly adhering to an acrostic. So
Right, right. And then the other piece that we do on that documentation is
yeah, this is
looking
the one I
at,
was.
yeah, so that was the meetings. And then this is looking at really the outcomes, if you will, right? So the
Yeah.
outcomes of the meeting. So, and maybe not outcomes isn't the right thing, but if you look at what these titles are, effectiveness of the S&OP process, right? So, and this is really to drive the point of who's accountable and who's responsible. And this is where I use this as a way when I'm working with somebody to say, how do we make sure we don't have these, two people that are sitting in that accountable, and responsible role. So the approval of the monthly S&OP plan, the demand plan, who's ultimately responsible for the demand plan. Now you can take this one level below the whole process and go, okay, I want to look at this by family. And I strongly encourage you to do that, right? To look at it by family and then on the demand streams. And we actually document that as part of the family documentation, which we'll cover a little bit. I think, actually, no, we already covered that in
Yeah.
the back, I can't remember, in the summertime, just on the executive presentation. You go back and check that out. But yeah, you can see here the supply plan, the buffer targets, holding the team to their accountabilities, and then data collection for the month end close. Who's going to do that stuff.
And
Um,
the ultimate person who's typically both accountable and responsible for maintaining this documentation is the S&OP coordinator, right? I mean,
that's
that's
right. That's right.
generally who we
And
see doing all of the documentation.
right. So if you're thinking about who's got to chase people down to say, well, is this clearly defined? That's really what you want them to do.
Yeah.
So, so I hopefully that's been clear for people. Just gives you that a bit of that kind of breakdown of how we look at that. It to me, and it's one of the things when we're starting working with a company, right? We will definitely talk through this early on, and especially at that executive level, right?
Sure.
Because to if I look at the success of a project, if there's not a clear willingness to take on the accountability for the S&OP process at the executive level, if I go back to those things I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk today, and that we've been really kind of driving on, is can I have this executive meeting that's an hour and a half, right? Is the executive actually engaged in that? If that executive isn't willing to be accountable, it's really hard and unfair for them to expect that we're going to have those outcomes, because the point I would make on that is this is their management process.
Yeah.
It's got to work for them, and they've got to be engaged enough that they're providing direction, they're providing feedback, they're making sure that it works or doesn't work for them. And so that's one of the things that we really try to do right up front. It's I don't won't call it a contract with them, but it's the thing I'm always looking for,
Sure.
just in terms of how do we actually help you make this happen. And then we lay a fairly standard process and a standard structure over top of that, so that
Mhm.
they can quickly know, how do I actually make this accountability work for me.
So, folks, that's why we call it an executive-led S&OP process, not just an executive S&OP process. We don't always get that in at the beginning, but if
Yeah.
if you've kind of followed, we've got a lot of structure. There's a lot of areas that you can focus on regarding what does good look like. This is the sixth element in the series of that. We've got an assessment online that you can use. I think it's a coming up. Yeah, that you can find at bezaperformance.com or dbmassist.com. It'll give you real clear prescriptions on a lot of stuff, including what we've talked about today regarding accountable and responsible tags for folks, and who is the right person to be responsible or accountable for the various components of the process. So, with that said, Doug, you have anything else before we wrap up?
I do not. I do not.
Well, have a great week. Good to see
Yeah.
everybody online here, and we'll see you in November.
All right. Sounds good.